With a scream that made Osrith think the armory was under attack, Osrith turned quickly to see a 6-foot warrior hurtling in her direction. It was dawn, the next day, and Elfkin, her once tiny framed trainee, tore past Miral and seized his former captain. "Osrith," he declared, then took a step backwards, letting go of her slowly, and grinning like a mad thing. Not a good start for a clandestine role, Osrith thought, and she narrowed her eyes, as if back to her captaincy, and said, sternly, "Is that any way for one of my guards to behave?" Confusion graced his features for a moment, his face beginning to fall. Then, he saw Osrith's mouth curl into a small smile and she had to ward him off from grabbing her too tightly again. "You fought so well at Tenholg, Captain," Elfkin declared, and told her he had counted 13 men he had slain. "And that was only because he cannot count any higher," his brother Eglfrith said, who had appeared beside him. The brothers were now of similar height and build as young adults, and the only thing Osrith could see that would distinguish between them was that Eglfrith was sporting a neatly cropped beard that matched his chestnut brown hair. Next to him, Oshir, who was smiling too. Her men, back, before her. "So how many did he kill?" she asked Eglfrith. "Got to be about 100, said his brother, proudly. "And 2 Welsh?" "2 Welsh?" Osrith asked, frowning a little. Were the Cymric not on the side of the Mersons that day? "They came at the call of Wessex, on the promise of the spoils," Oshir told her. "And there are less Norsemen and Danes to raid their land. They would never have been there for Mercia." Osrith smiled again. Border disputes from time immemorial. Could she have expected Mersons and Cymric fighting next to one another not to remind one another of ancient grudges? "Do not let it happen again," Osrith chided, but lightly, because her heart felt light and joyful and contented. If she thought she could not feel happier just then, it was nothing to what she felt when one more warrior stepped behind Oshir. He was older, grey-flecked his hair and beard, and his face was more lined and sun-darkened. But she could not mistake Elfrith, at one time her only ally when she had no one, when they served the Lord Odda. It was her turn to fly to someone and Elfrith caught her gently about the waist and kissed the top of her head. "How glad I am to see you, safe, well," he declared, as Osrith looked up to him. "You look ... different, somehow." Elfrith looked her up and down. "It was over a dozen years ago, I'm much older, Elfrith," she replied. Her hair, she knew, though braided, with Eric's jewel in it near the back had white strands in it. She used a teasel to comb it through sometimes after washing it, and there were more of them than there had ever been. "I'll tell you, later," she added, catching his knowing look, and she added, "and you can tell me about how Earl is." Earl was Elfrith's wife, who cooked in the palaces where he worked. "Later," Elfrith nodded, patiently, "after we show you the guard." "I know the guard," Osrith insisted. But Elfrith shook his head. "I mean, the guard. Loyal Mersons," he added. But said nothing more on the matter for, just then, Miral appeared at the door. "Captain, you are needed, in the courtyard," he told her. Osrith nodded quickly to her men, and followed him quickly. This shouldn't have been happening, she thought, as Miral led her to the courtyard between the stables and the kitchens. Something was wrong. And indeed it was wrong. One of the men had recognized her and pointed her out to Eardwulf. Whether he remembered her or not, Osrith had no idea. For Eardwulf had summoned all of the captains before him, and gave them instructions for guarding the Lord of Mercia. "He is never to be left, a guard will be placed within and without," he told them. "You will patrol the Bay as usual, and double down the shifts around the gates." Osrith watched as the man she remembered in her darker thoughts rubbed his beard, as he looked over them. "The West Saxons are coming. You will show them they are in Mercia now, and they are the guests. For Mercia. For Mercia." The guards shouted. "Mercia. Mercia. 88,888,888. The reason she looked strange, Osrith thought, was that the jerkin, shirt and breeches that Miral had brought for her did not fit. She had had to abandon her cloth, and her breasts bobbed in front of her, already noticeably larger for her pregnancy, her areola darker, her nipples bigger. They were much more tender, too, and when she had changed that morning, trying to slip into the shirt, the pain in her chest was too much for her to manage, and she had sent word and a chink of silver with a small child that lived in the poorer part of the city, which was much more likely to be delivered than by a child in a richer part. More shirts had come, and her breasts were pressed into even the largest 1 cent. The outline of her nipples as they fought with the linen could be seen when she had pulled it over her chest. The jerkin fitted, however, and did a good job of hiding her breasts. But it was her breeches which were the problem now, where even her once slim hips had fitted well into breeches. Her hips were wider now, and gaped near the top as they would not pull up any further. Osrith made a note to herself that she would get a seamstress to adjust a pair for her, for it would do no good if she was in a fight and they fell down. Perhaps the enemy would die laughing. There was little chance that day now, for when she returned to Miral, Osrith smiled at him, and shrugged. It seems that, though you put aside auxiliary captain, it did not put you aside, Miral told her. I can instruct Elfrith, but Osrith shook her head. Where do we guard first? She asked, and was relieved to hear they would be at the back of the ramparts, near the palisade. They would be out until the moon began to set, watching the land. A discreet position, Osrith thought, a shrewd move on Miral's part so that she was not too near the palace with her men, so she could talk to them. So they were within hearing distance of few people. And talk had moved to Tenhulg again as the night wore on. Eglfrith and Elfkin played a variation on, next one in the inn, only a dirtier version, which was, next woman, would you hump her? Clearly a well-established game amongst the men. Osrith leaned back on the wooden railings, arms folded next to Elfrith, as they played, Oshia giving out scores as to whether either of his friends would actually manage to pull said woman in real life. Jarl? Asked Osrith as Elfrith turned to her himself. Why are you different, really? He said, at the same time. Osrith smiled, glad that Elfrith began talking first, stood closer to him, as Eglfrith caught something that one of the women he was calling down to had thrown up to him. He yelled, and dropped what turned out to be horse dung. What else would a woman throw it to a guard who was heckling her, and all of them, including Osrith and Elfrith, fell about laughing. Leave the women of Aylesbury, Osrith said. We are to be on our very best behavior if the West Saxons come here. We will kill them all if they talk to Merson girls, Eglfrith said, defensively. No, you will not, Osrith replied. Girls can tell which men are fools, they can make their own choices. Especially now they have seen how stupid you three are, it won't take much for them to impress. Even now, she could not tell her men off as she should, and a smile had overtaken her mouth, which was hard to remove. How happy she was in their company. She had felt like she had been living when she was captain here. How she missed her comrades, how glorious to have 3 of them at least before her now. Go, take the Sunwise Guard, she told them. We will be relieved soon, and we can go to an alehouse. Still smiling, Osrith turned back to Elfrith. But the usually loquacious man held his lips together, and looked to Osrith, and then out into the blackness of the night. Edith died, of a fever, 3 years ago, the man told her. I miss her, Osrith, he added. Osrith took his shoulder, and turned him to her. In the torchlight, she saw his cheeks were damp, and it was as much as she could do to stop herself from dissolving into tears. Another sign, she told herself, for Osrith rarely cried. I miss here, Osrith told him. I had to flee Wessex, did you know? I knew, Elfrith replied. Though not the reason. He bent his head lower to her. Do you wish to tell me? Osrith shook her head. Not now, not when things are so fraught here. I miss Old Helm, she added. Elfrith gave a smile. You got on with him, didn't you? He mused. Not a lot of people did. He was pious, he was particular about things. It made him a good lord, but he was hard to like. I couldn't save him, at Tenhulg, Osrith told him. I saw him cut down, he saved many lives that day. Do you think that will be the battle we remember? She added, like those older than us remember Ethandun? Could be, Elfrith replied. The West Saxons are dominating more and more of the land. It is convenient to them that the Danes and Norse are here, devastating, of course, but they have power and influence enough to make it work to their advantage. Look at the lordship crisis we are about to have. And, as another captain relieved their company of the northern border, Osrith listened to Elfrith carefully, telling her the situation in Mercia. Pushing open the Black Bull alehouse door and stepping over a number of inebriated guests, they made their way to the only free table, near the back by the kitchens, which stank of something foul and made Osrith feel sick. It was a little better when she gave Elfrith silver to stand them all drinks to mark her first duty with her company, and her nose in a jar of goat's milk helped a little, although the taste of the milk seemed strange. She remembered other women talking about this sort of thing, mainly the maids back at Alba, one of whom was pregnant and another, who was a mother of two. Osrith sipped the drink carefully, listening to Elfrith talk politics. Sheolwulf, the last true ruler we had here, Elfrith began, had a younger sister who had only one son, Ethelred. His father was a Mercian noble too, who had a sister, who was sent to be wed to a lording in Northumbria. Osrith continued in her head. She knew this. Northumbria. Elfrith continued, drinking his ale, as if he had never seen it before, cautiously, as if suspicious of it. Sheolad was the last king of Mercia, so we say, yet the West Saxons call him Lord to diminish his role. His line stretches back to Offa, Penda, all the way back to Isel himself. Osrith touched Finan's coin in her jerkin, felt the relief work and the hole at the top. Sheolwulf shared the head of the coin with Alfred. In clear light, Osrith thought she saw one of the images crossing hands over the top of the hand of the other, the one which represented Alfred, for the same image was on a coin that was only him. Even in the pockets of Mercians the symbolism could not be clearer. Wessex was the dominant partner in the Union, and Mercians needed to be reminded of it. But, of course, he is not the last, Elfrith continued, as the younger warriors began to flick little stones they had collected over the course of the evening into an empty ale jar. One flicked close to Osrith, and she took it up, aimed, and missed spectacularly. The young men cheered, regardless, as Elfkin's eye rested on a young girl who had stopped walking down the stairs at the back of the bar, and was smiling at him. Ethelred is the last Mercian. Bergerd and Ludica's family are nobles. Many married into the female line after Ecgfrith, Offa's son. The line ended there, they say, but both men have claimed similar, if weaker, connections to the Isel line. He sipped his ale again, and again. It was a delicate sip. This was not like the man Osrith remembered. Then she told herself, she was not as he remembered, either. Obviously, with Sheolwulf alive, and hope of a good brood of children from Alfred's line with Ethelfled, the dynasty was secure. What we now have are two old men chasing a throne with little between them in terms of claim, Ludica with no living sons after to Tenhulg, and Bergerd with only Bergd, who is too young to claim anything like what Mercia needs. A 16-year-old has not the wherewithal to solidify alliances, and while he could fight on the battlefield, he must not, for there would be a wife and children to produce, and he can't do that if he's, what? What? Osrith echoed. You're smiling. Grinning, in fact. What have I said that is so amusing? Osrith patted his hand. I am just glad to be home, that is all, Osrith said, thinking how Elfrith had opened up to become the man she remembered him to be, thriving on gossip and intrigue over a drink after guard shift. Mercia, home, not Alba. I needed steadiness in my life, and God provided. You won't find that in Aylesbury, Elfrith replied, dryly. Try Tamworth, on the border further north. At least they only have Danes to deal with. Their lord, Ecgwulf, is alive and well, and not dying of a head injury from Tenhulg. He sighed, outwardly. We have had 3 duty changes in the last week alone, and our hours have increased. Barely time to get any running repairs done. Things are getting left, and there's going to be mistakes being made, before too long, because things are not being overseen. Eardwulf knows what he's doing, I think. He hates the West Saxons after their humiliation of his father drove them to poverty. He would have independence still? Like Old Helm? Perhaps, said Elfrith, putting down his ale before he had even taken a sip. "Our line is that we want peace. But plenty will." He broke off and turned his head round to watch Eglfrith stand up and wander over to the banister, where there, presumably, Hor had come down a few more steps and was fluttering her eyelashes in what she must have thought was a coquettish manner. "Put that girl down, lad," Elfrith shouted to Eglfrith. "She doesn't know where you've been." "In with the pigs," Oshir called, and it was true, the smell was probably the men, if they had had to work so hard and had little time to look after themselves. That was going to change as of the morning. Her company were going to be the cleanest in Aylesbury, no matter the complaining they were going to do when she made them all go down to the Teme River to wash at dawn. She had silver enough to reclothe them, thanks, in part, to her wretched brother, which she had brought some of with her back from Alba. What better use but to spend it on her men, to make them smart, and proud of their work? Plenty will, Osrith told herself. Independence was a given in Mercia, not a vague hope. They thought of themselves as independent, with Wessex encroaching on them. Alfred's dealing at Lundin was probably the first step. Wessex had driven the victory in a mercen city, and that stung them. It had been Aldhelm who had pointed this out to her many years before. He had even predicted that the mercenaries would resist to Alfred's dream. Had she been wrong in stating her opinion? Osrith had advised the lady over the lord, and Aldhelm. He had given his adoration to that charismatic schemer. Her father's daughter through and through. Not for the first time Osrith wondered where it had gone wrong. She could have been an ally to Ethelfled. But then, the attention could not be shared. For the Lady of Mercia, no women, none, could be in her orbit. And now he was dead, at Titenholg, and Osrith found she missed him dearly. The young men were laughing now, and this time, Elfrith put his hand into his pocket, and sent Oshir. "None for me," he told the boy. "Why so?" Osrith asked. Was it the ale? He had seemed standoffish about it all evening. "After Earl. I had a problem with it, a difficulty." "You didn't like it?" Osrith asked. He shook his head. "Oh, I liked it only too well. It took Aldhelm," he seemed to sigh the man's name, "to pick me up from the guardhouse floor where I had fallen in a drunken stupor one night to tell me that it was no way for a mercen to behave, and would I like to go back to Wessex to serve the rest of the years there." He chuckled to Osrith. "No, thank you very much. Aldhelm may have been stuck up, but he is nothing to the stuck-up, self-satisfied lordlings in that country. The outcome is important, you know that, Osrith," he pressed on. "How we get them matters little. Or should not. Odd knew that, and shielded us from a great deal, I believe." He paused, and they both remembered their former lord for a good minute. "But then, with some of them, the knives are not straight enough. Linen from Francia on a Saturday, Irish linen for fast days." Osrith smiled, knowing exactly what he meant. She could no more stand on ceremony than Elfrith, although he hid it better. Osrith had been far too outspoken, she couldn't have been anything else. And she failed in Wessex, and though she told herself enough that it shouldn't feel ashamed, Osrith, on bad days, felt it by the bucketload. "You can try the goat's milk if you like," Osrith told her friend, more to get off the subject of Wessex than anything else. Elfrith gave her a glance, and she pushed her pot closer, as Oshir balanced 2 ales while behind him, Eglfrith carried another, and a goat's milk for Osrith. Which, indeed, she needed, for Elfrith knocked back what remained in her jar, then sprayed it all over the floor. "How can you drink that?" he exclaimed, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. "It tastes of goat," Osrith suggested. "Goat that hasn't been cleaned out for a year. Ah." He turned back to his original ale and took a long draught from it. "Now I appreciate the ale from our northern districts of our fine land, and will never disparage St. Modwen's finest in my life." St. Modwen had come from very far north, now far into Daneland, once Mercen too, a place called Burtone. The waters were said to be blessed by her, and Osrith considered she must have been a busy saint, for many ale-making districts also claimed sweet waters. On her part, she could hardly discern a difference, if she drank ale, and Osrith considered she might, if the goat's milk was going to be as strongly tasting as this. Now, yourself, Elfrith encouraged, as they crossed the square before the front of the palace. Osrith stopped, as the younger men of her company crossed to the stables and made their way up to their rest. Osrith shook her head. There is too much already going on for me to tell you, she said to him. Not yet, not now. I find I am older, which is the shorter answer. May I ask you not to press me for more just now? Her friend nodded, and glanced towards the palace, which was lit up by many torches. Osrith had not noticed them the night before, and Miral had told her that they lit the palace day and night in vigil for their lord. Oh, by the way, we are going to the team at dawn, Osrith told him. Have the men in the armory at cockcrow. Going for a stroll, are we? Elfrith asked, lightly. Going for a bathe, Osrith corrected him, and Elfrith pulled a face. I am your captain, and I am not having my company stink worse than livestock. I can't help Earwolf and his changes, but I can help us not get sick. Understood, Elfrith replied. Just let me stand next to you when you tell them, Osrith, because I want to see the look on their faces. 88,888,888. She left silver in Miral's palm after explaining what she wanted the new uniform's form, and folded her arms when he tried to press it back to her. It's stolen, anyway, she added, with relish. Not from Mercia, although it may have originally come from here. A very tired-looking lord examined the coins, which were, she knew, a collection from many mints, even one from Francia. You may take what you wish. It matters little at the moment, he replied, pushing the silver onto the table used for furling and unfurling the marching standards. You will take this and give it away, Osrith, for Mercia will not accept your silver, we pay you. Remember, not the other way round. Reluctantly, Osrith gathered up the coins and opened her pocket, strung around her hips, pushing the coins back into it. He looked ill, Osrith considered, and Miral sighed again, and confirmed this to Osrith, telling her he had been up all night, standing beside Ethelred's bedside, who could not recover, in his opinion. You are to take the men tonight to our lord, Miral told her. Sundown, and you change guards with Godfrey's men. You will see for yourself. Elfrith was frustratingly correct when he had told Osrith the men would not like to bathe, even though they were getting new clothes for the privilege. Osrith, who took as many opportunities as she could to bathe, was rather short with them, and bossed them through the kitchen gate and across the fields to choruses of, "We will die of fever," and, Yardred said it made his skin come off. They hovered at the river bank, mist coming off the fields as the sun began to rise, and Osrith knelt beside the slowly twisting water and stuck in her hand, pulling it back out again at its coldness. But she wasn't going to back down now, and Elfrith had gamely stripped down to his underbreeches, before wading into the water. Look, he told them. Nothing to worry about. Beside him, some of the plants were growing thickly, and he pulled up handfuls and began to wash his body. You next, Oshir, Osrith said, laying down the 4 uniforms on a large rock beside the river. But, before the boy could even take off his jerkin, Elfrith began to sink in the water and thrash about, as if something in the water had taken hold of him. Quick! Shouted Osrith, help him. That got them moving. Oshir, his jerkin cast behind him, threw himself into the water, trying to grasp Elfrith's arms. He was a broad man, and the young boy had trouble reaching for a limb. Elfkin was next, and a reluctant Egelfrith, who gave Osrith a despairing look, threw off his own leather jerkin and got in too. When it looked as if none of them were going to be able to help, Osrith, forgetting herself, threw her own on the floor and entered the water from the downwards flow, wondering what it was that had happened. The river was shallow, there seemed nothing in the water, no creature. And then Elfrith stopped struggling, and the young guards backed away from him. Had he drowned? Osrith thought. And she forced her legs through the water to her guard, ducking down to shoulder height, trying to feel for him. And then a voice came from beside her. For your own sake, don't stand up in the water yet. She turned her head. Elfrith was beside her, quite well, and had turned to her guards. Lads, go down a bit, give the captain some room. You are well? Egelfrith ventured to their deputy. Course I am. You silly bugger. I had to get you in somehow. There were roars of laughter, and the youngsters splashed about in the water, and Osrith called, If I had known you were going in fully clothed, I would have saved my silver on your new uniforms. You paid for their uniforms? Elfrith asked, his hand still on her shoulder, her chin at the surface. I tried, Miral just gave it back to me. He looks ill, Elfrith, she told him. I get now how serious this is, and I haven't even seen the Lord Deathleard yet. Osrith spat some of the river water from her mouth. We are on close guard to him tonight, she added, then forced her shoulder against her friend's hand. Not just yet. Don't want to give the boys spontaneous heart attacks, do you? He said. I don't know how close any of them have ever been to a woman, but one look at your front view, you might just tip them over the edge. Osrith thought for a second, then clamped her hands over her chest. Not professional at all, Osrith agreed as Elfrith put his hands together to make a stirrup for her to put her foot on, and she hauled herself up out of the river. Then she heard her friend gasp. You're back, he began, and then, as Elfrith pulled himself up next to Osrith, he looked across to her. A long time ago, she answered, to the question he hadn't asked. The one who did it is dead. There were more? Elfrith asked, but Osrith shook her head, her own mouth closed to answers. She held up her left hand. Scar, she added, and pointed to her own. She had defiantly rammed a spear into the unconscious hand of her brother, pinning him to the table boards with it as it penetrated clean through his hand from the force of Osrith's anger. Then, just 2 words. One day, she told him, and Elfrith nodded. One day she would tell him that it was her own brother that had tricked her. But not today. How many months? He asked her, changing tack, being with child. Osrith reached for her jerkin, and turned from him, slipping it over her ample bosom. For his part, Elfrith turned too, and called to young men of their company to use some of the meadow sweet under their pits and round their necks. 3, she said, possibly. I cannot use my bindings any more. That I saw, Elfrith replied, wryly as Osrith ran a hand over her stomach, which was already starting to protrude a little from her hips, although at the moment, it looked to her as if she'd just eaten a big meal. Should you be fighting at all? Guarding, Osrith told him. I tried to give up the role of auxiliary captain, but, with the situation, she broke off, and turned to her men. Come on, lads. Osrith called over, as Elfkin, Egelfrith and Oshia began to splash about. Time to get out and into your new clothes. She called, and the young warriors, so skeptical about getting into the water, were now reticent to leave it. And get them on over there. The captain does not want to see your hairy asses. Elfrith grinned, then placed a hand on her arm, and suddenly looked abashed. I struck up a friendship with Miral, something I am not very proud of, he told her, as the young guards began to dispense with their wet things and Osrith caught sight of bare behinds pulling up new underbreeches and laughed. And I realize, well, it is men for me, well, he added awkwardly. Not men, a man. One man, he whispered, then added, a little louder, otherwise, having seen your tits Osrith, you wouldn't have stood a chance. You've seen them before. Dismissed Osrith, and they began to walk back to the palace. They were not so big then, Elflat teased, as he pointed to their men, each proud that they now owned a spare uniform, something rare, and, once dried, meant they could continue to keep themselves clean, and they were holding out their own clothes to the early morning light, hoping to catch some heat waves would begin to dry them out. Only some of the Wessex factions provided seconds, and Osrith was pleased, for a moment, but they remembered the turmoil that was rippling through the Mercen citadel. No bell had rung, however, so Deathleard still lived, at least. He was there for me when Jarl died, Elfrith continued. Have I shocked you? He added, as they reached the kitchen gate. Perhaps it was God's punishment for me, Jarl dying, and all those children of ours. Osrith shook her head vehemently, and put her hand on his forearm. Would it surprise you to know I knew a king who had similar feelings? Osrith told him. If it's love, it doesn't matter, in my opinion. I have seen so many things fall apart by the wrong match, the lord and the lady here. There was a brief look of relief on Elfrith's face. It hadn't happened for a good while, not since to Tenhulg, he continued, as Osrith walked beside him. I did not know he felt like that about men. I thought he was married, didn't you? I thought so, Osrith agreed. Right back to our time with Odda. People change. The king I knew, well, for family pressure, sold out his lover. Sold out? Slavery, Osrith told him, gravely, as his friend's face creased into an expression of horror. Truly? Elfrith looked aghast. Osrith nodded twice. I was able to get him out. Finoli, she added. Findle, really? He was a very dear friend to me, Elfrith, she added. And Domhnall, well, he was king in waiting. I have heard that name before, Domhnall. King of Alba? Osrith supplied, and she felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Something to be grateful to Ethelfled for. Yes, Finan told her brother, but the most beloved lady would have told him eventually. She had probably planned the staging of it, knowing her, Osrith thought, cattily, for maximum effect. But, no longer, did she have to keep her past a secret. King Domhnall of Alba? Elfrith repeated, then glanced back at Osrith to check that it wasn't her this time pulling a stunt. As they reached the stable yard, her men turned to her, as a shabby squadron of guards marched past them. She saw Egelfrith grin, and Osrith's heart soared. He was proud of his uniform, and having seconds, they weren't clean and they didn't. Be here at dusk, we are guarding Lord Ethlier tonight. Do as you will, Osrith cautioned, but make sure you sleep. We must be prepared for anything this night, and I will not have you shame us all with thoughtless behavior. The young men said their goodbyes once Osrith had dismissed them, Oshir and Egelfrith comparing their old shirts to one another, competing, as boys will, for the worst tears and wear and stains that the river could not eliminate. They are pleased, Elfrith told her. It was a good thing you did. It was a sensible thing I did, and it was Miral, not me. She looked about her. It was this place. It is like a land waiting for a storm, waiting for the lightning and thunder to rent the heavens. Elfrith nodded. Had you better get some rest yourself? He asked. Osrith turned to him. If you are going to say, in your condition, I will demote you right now. She declared. There's always room for men to clean the garderobe next to the slaves. Elfrith smiled. I was going to say, once you've eaten. You fought at Tenhulg in such a condition and survived, but could not have been many months. It gets tougher as the weeks go on, believe me. Osrith looked at her friend and narrowed her eyes. Yal, Elfrith managed. She lost ... so many children, and I lost her with one more. Then, he could say no more. And suddenly, Osrith felt guilty, guilt for the child within her, that she sometimes felt herself resenting for her life was changing and one day she would have to down Buey, but also for the children she had aborted, unwanted, produced, bar one, after her own pleasure. Sex had been good for her, as well as the 2, or rather 3, hymns she had been with. 4, if she was honest with herself, but Osrith refused to let her brain pick open that box in her head which was sealed permanently. That he was dead, and a Danish man's soul retrieved from the cold Danish hell along into the bargain, and it never happened. But to hear how wanted a child was between Elfrith and Earl, a man and a woman devoted to one another so much that they moved around together, was hard to hear. I know you are sorry for me, and in time, I will be able to speak of it, Elfrith confessed. I am to my bed too, and new uniform, he added. Thank you, my captain. And with that, her friend headed to the palace, to the rooms at the far back. I hope Miral is resting up there too, Osrith thought, as he made her way back through the streets until she came to her own house. Barring the door behind her, she didn't even bother taking off her clothes. As soon as she saw her bed, Osrith felt her eyelids grow heavy, and she lay down on it and slept a deep, enclosing sleep.